Time now to bring in three colleagues from the Parliamentary Press Gallery to discuss the key stories of the day, and it turns out there are a number of them. Tonda MacCharles is a parliamentary reporter with the Toronto Star. Joel-Denis Bellavance is the parliamentary bureau chief for Presse, and John Ivision is a columnist with the National Post and parliamentary bureau chief for Postmedia. Good to see you all. Quite a day. We have the police moving in on the blockades. We have Teck Industries backing off the big mine project in Alberta, and we have Alberta, I think, surprise to a lot of people, winning its appeal against the federal carbon tax, with the Court of Appeal in Alberta ruling 4-1 for Alberta, after Saskatchewan and Ontario courts had ruled in favor of the federal government. What do you make of all this, Tonda, and what the sort of state of things in the country?
Wow, that's a huge question. Certainly, the events of the last few weeks show that the governments can't get their act together, the governments of First Nations can't get their acts together, and now the courts of the country, the superior appeal courts in the country, can't even agree on a pretty crucial legal question. So when it comes to the big bargain of the carbon tax and carbon pricing, which has kind of pitted this government against the energy sector, against the Conservatives, and, you know, lost them friends amongst Indigenous people because they're not advancing their concerns either. A lot of it's going to, I think, end up at the Supreme Court around the carbon tax plan and whether that's the way to go forward. We're going to hear a case next month at the Supreme Court of Canada. They're hearing Saskatchewan's appeal because Saskatchewan and Ontario have lost at their courts the claim that only provinces can decide these things. That, in fact, those courts ruled that Ottawa gets to decide. So look, I think it's all coming to a head. It is, I think, inflaming tensions all over the country. I just would hesitate for us to sort of weigh in and fan those flames and say, you know, the country's breaking apart. I think these are processes that are working their way along, and hopefully at some point the politicians and the Indigenous leaders will all sort of have a come to Jesus moment and figure out if they can get along.
It does seem to be perhaps a more dangerous intersection, Joel-Denis, that we're coming to and that we're in than we've seen for some time.
And the cause of it is the debate about the necessity to build or not big energy projects. That's the big cause of it, and I think it is provoking sort of a existential crisis in Canada, relationship with First Nations, relationship with provinces, relationship with provinces, and also the duty to fight climate change, but also promote a sound economy. And this is all coming up to at a time when Mr. Trudeau was hoping that it would have more calm waters after a series of cascade of international events that almost threw his governance agenda off. Now, this coming from domestic issues is also throwing his agenda off the table.
Yeah, what do you think, John?
Well, I think the Conservatives and Jason Kenney have leapt on this as a failure of the Trudeau government. They politicised the regulatory process. They killed this thing by delay. But if you read the letter that came from the Teck Resources chief executive, what he actually talked about was the need for governments to get their
there
act
seems to be
together.
enough blame to go around.
Exactly.
Yeah, the need for governments, plural, i.e. in this country there is no clear policy on climate change. And as a result, we are seeing not only a flight of existing capital, but no new capital coming into the country, and a lot of big players now saying we're not going to invest in the oil sands. BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager, has said that it's not going to invest in the oil sands. HSBC, a lot of big insurers, they're all pulling out. The Canadian banks and insurers are being kept there only because I think Jason Kenney's telling them we'll boycott your companies if you do anything. And nobody's really speaking for Canada. Kenney and Trudeau are too busy having this internecine conflict for anybody to turn around to the international markets and say, look, we've still got a good story to tell. You know, we do have high emissions, but they're coming down intensity per barrel, and it's a very regulated market. We don't do things that are happening elsewhere.
But what we don't have is certainty for those investors and certainty around climate action plans. And that's what's at the heart of that court decision. And that's what Teck Resources in that letter said was the problem. They said they agree with carbon pricing. They agree that there has to be action taken to meet targets. They want to be able to invest with that in mind and to export what they say is energy that will basically displace, replace dirty energy elsewhere.
It seems to be an indictment, that letter, of policy makers
exactly.
in this country about, look at, what do you want us to do? I mean, you're fighting over carbon taxes. You can't tell us, in terms of a climate change plan, what the shelf life of our project might be. What do you expect from us over the 40 years that a project might, like, what are the mitigation measures we take? How do they count in the plan, and what our responsibility is? And if you're an investor, you're looking at that and going,
yeah, and
exactly,
today, sir, go ahead.
You've got different level of governments fighting policies that is supposed to help fight climate change. Provincial governments fighting federal government. You've got First Nations fighting the federal government as well. So you've got a massive conflict over big energy projects, and what signal does it send to investors, not only here but also abroad, that Canada maybe is not the right place to invest right now because we don't know what the rules will be to our project, and that is causing some I think investors to rethink their own investment in Canada.
And the voice of business in Canada, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce today, called for all of these regulatory processes to be depoliticized, and that there has to be certainty once a regulating body says, gives an approval for a project, it should be able to proceed.
Yeah, Goldie Hayer from the Business Council made the same point earlier. That get your act together.
But under this, I just want to point out, though, that this is the thing. Successive governments, both Conservative and Liberal now, have left the power to override regulations or regulatory decisions in the energy sector with federal cabinets. So it is by its very nature ultimately a very political decision, and any opponent to a project knows that if they want to fight it, they got to start work in the caucus and the cabinet, and that's happened. That happened under the Harper government, is happening under the Liberal government.
But as the investor types will point out, that's great, and we can do all that, and then a government changes and comes in with a whole different plan, and we're back. All the stuff we thought we'd figured out gets unfigured.
I mean, in Britain, they came to a consensus on climate change. I think under the Cameron government, 2010 to 2014, they all signed on to the same project, and they're still signed on to it, despite whatever government comes in. Theresa May, before she went out, her last policy was on climate change. Boris Johnson's now signed up for no emissions in cars or no gas cars by 2035. That consensus allows people to plan forward, and they've done pretty good things.
Now, the ultimate test to me will be how the government handles the TMX file. We can expect unrest in British Columbia from First Nations who still oppose that project to try to derail it. And if the government,
but you see, the government in that case, the government
they're aligned on this one, so that might actually work.
Right. Yeah. But they can also get on the phone to the shareholder and say, please don't abandon the project. Oh, by the way, we're the shareholder. So, I mean, that does provide a certainty that you don't get another project.
It's not as if it's impossible for the government of Alberta and the government of Canada to get along on policy. The large emitters scheme, which Alberta had already had in place, the feds took a look at it and said, that's good enough. We'll live with that. Now
Except that it was only in place for a year. It was not going to be a long-term plan, and then the federal carbon tax was going to have the backstop was going to have to kick anyway.
Not for large emitters.
For large emitters,
the large emitter scheme is one that the Alberta contrived, and the feds have agreed to. In theory, if Alberta came up with its own carbon tax for taxpayers, the federal backstop wouldn't have to kick in, but of course it's politics. So,
well, now it sounds like maybe
complicated.
And with the court ruling out of Alberta today, it sounds like the whole thing may be thrown up in the air again now. While we figure out exactly who has jurisdiction to tell us what to do on climate and policy.
It's so Canadian, eh?
We're out of time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.